Hello, all, and welcome to this session on climate security modeling. We're glad to have you here, even a couple minutes after the start time. My name is Annika Erickson-Pearson, and I'm the head of community management at the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. We've focused quite some attention over the past year on the nexus between environment, climate, conflict, and peace. So I'm really pleased to be here today to moderate this session. Before I jump into the content, I just have a couple of housekeeping points. We are here on Zoom and you are there watching via live stream. It is my goal of goals to keep this lively and interesting. And I know we're all juggling quite a lot. So hopefully this hour gets you out of your inbox and into conversation with us. How do we achieve that? Today we'll be using the chat function for that. So our great tech moderator here will be sending me your questions and comments. So please do make use of that function. Okay. On to the good stuff. So the relationship between environment, climate, conflict, and peace is inherently very complex. We cannot assign direct causal relationships in many cases, and the environment can either be a bridge or a spoiler to peace. It's a relationship to unravel carefully. The problem is not necessarily data. In fact, there is plenty of data to assess environmental, climate, and security issues. The challenge instead lies in those complex indirect impacts of environmental events. How do we provide practitioners with spatially explicit risks and actionable insights? Capacity is growing among many organizations, governments, policymakers, international organizations to provide relevant data-driven insights to support decision-making and programming around these issues. However, full quantitative, predictive, early warning, early action has not been achieved yet in the climate and environmental security field yet. So that's why we're here today. This session aims to discuss best practices and understand whether or not there are common do's and don'ts in climate security modeling for programming and policy support. So the session today is going to work like this. We have 3 experts here to pitch their tools in climate security modeling. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and I will be strict with timekeeping, you 3. I'll start with a number of questions for them afterwards, but that's where you come in. If you have questions, please submit them. I could ask these 3 questions for 3 hours, but the point is for you actually to get as much out of this as possible. So finally, on that note, I just want to say there are likely a number of experts out there in the audience watching as well. So please do write in with your expertise. I will be reading your comments and reading some of them out loud so that this can be as much of an exchange as possible. If we can't all be on the same Zoom call together, let's at least try to interact through the chat. Okay, so that's it by way of an introduction from me. I've used up my 3 minutes. And with that, I'm glad to turn it over to our first expert, Marie Schellens of the United Nations Environment Program, to introduce our first tool, Strata.
Hi, everyone. Let me start by sharing my screen. This one. Does that look okay? Okay, so I'm very excited to be here, first of all. The Early Warning, Early Action Practitioners Workshop. This is the second version, I think, of it. I missed last year, but I heard about it just afterwards, and I thought it was a great idea. I have bookmarked a lot of the sessions already in my agenda for this week, so I'm very happy that we were able to put in this panel discussion as well on climate security modeling. So I'll be pitching Strata here, presenting the project at UNEP, which is a collaboration also with the University of Edinburgh, who is more the scientific partner, and Earthblocks, who is a small tech company for geospatial visualization and analysis, who is supporting us in creating the kind of web-based platform behind the Strata project. So as Annika already introduced very well, around the world, we're really seeing the impacts of climate change unfolding around us. And together with also environmental degradation and mismanagement of natural resources, these kind of climate change and environmental impacts are threatening our food and water and energy supplies. They're undermining livelihoods, and they're damaging essential infrastructures. So in crisis-affected countries, these impacts from climate change can actually really exacerbate the already existing social and economic risks, and that way they can lead to, for example, increased competition, forced displacement, and eventually also violent conflicts. At the same time, it's not a one direction causality. At the same time, also insecurity risks from peace and security actually hinder climate change adaptation and resilience building adaptation efforts. So this actually leaves already very vulnerable communities even poorer and less resilient into the future. So what we need, and what there has been a demand from many organizations, among others, to UNEP, for more and better improved analysis of these interlinked climate change and security risks to inform policies and programs. But up to now, the capacity for data-driven environmental security assessments really remains in the hands of a couple of experts. So, for example, you need very deep coding skills, you need to know a lot about Earth observation, you need high bandwidth and storage on your computers, or you need maybe a large budget to kind of outsource this to other organizations. And so we really heard this urgent need to make environmental security intelligence more readily available for everyone. So that means both environmental and climate security data, make it accessible, make it understandable, and at the same time also this analytical capacity, make that available for practitioners and policymakers without the necessary prior technical know-how of how to deal with this data, but definitely the more contextual know-how of how to implement this information and these insights on the ground. And that's why we developed Strata, or why we are developing Strata. It's not a finished project yet. So what we aim to do with Strata is, first of all, provide a rapid identification of climate and environmental hotspots, and provide specifically insights where and when these will occur. And then thirdly, we want to quantify also the overlap with existing socioeconomic and political risks, so that you have an indication of where these climate and environmental risks might actually translate into forced displacement, the social unrest, into conflict, or maladaptive practices. And lastly, we all do this so that these data-driven insights can actually inform end users with very area-specific risk reduction measures, climate change adaptation, or resilience building solutions. So we want to move that step further beyond just risk identification and really also move into the solution recommendation space. Currently, we're working on a Somalia pilot, so we didn't want to address this problem from a global perspective right away, but a very context-specific approach. And so we're heavily investing in co-design with our stakeholders on the ground in Somalia, and our goal is to have a running pilot by the end of this year for Somalia. So what we try to do, as Annika mentioned, there is a lot of data available already. How do we now make sense of all this complexity? How do we bring this together? And we're using a quite simple approach called the convergence of evidence. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but actually it just layers separate data sets. When a certain data layer, for example, a data layer on pollution exceeds a certain threshold, that we flag it as a risk, and then we layer all these different types of environmental risks that have been flagged if they exceed a certain threshold on top of each other, and then you can count kind of the flags to understand, okay, how many environmental and climate risks are actually coming together here. I already mentioned that we heavily invest in co-design, so that means in the way how we visualize our data, but that also means in the way in which indicators are picked, for example, for this Somalia case study. Then that means this co-design means that we can really have area-specific risk identification and not just a global indicator that might show, okay, Somalia has more problems than the neighboring country, but really provide subnational indications of issues of interest to those people working there. And that also then leads to better proposals for actions. Lastly, I want to say that we really want to make sure with this co-design approach that it plugs directly into existing early warning and early action platforms. That might not be data-driven platforms. It could be data-driven platforms that we input our outputs to, but it could also just be a policy framework or a workflow that our information then actually kind of streamlines environmental and climate data into. So this is a mock-up of how the dashboard might look. This is not the final version at all. Actually, currently we're holding co-design workshops and testing different kind of mock-ups, different kind of visualizations to see whether end users actually would prefer and what conveys the best kind of information. But the point is that you would get a default heat map of environmental and climate stresses, and that it's easy to use, that it's focused for non-technical users, and that you can, for example, click on one of these hotspots, and that then opens up a window giving you more information about the environmental issues happening there, what are the socioeconomic vulnerabilities underlying also that issue, and what are potential nature-based solutions. And then you could, for example, click further, and that would open up then more in-depth information about the underlying data. And then further, we want to make sure that also more that's the default use of the platform, but we want to make sure that more advanced users can also go deeper, and so they would be able, through a drag and drop interface, kind of take out existing certain indicators that might not be relevant for them, upload data sets that are more relevant to them or that have a better resolution for the specific area that they're interested in researching. And so the dashboard will be really key to improve the integrated assessments of climate and environmental security for these non-technical but more contact and peace building experts on the ground. So the benefits of Strata that we really try to push forward is that we can rapidly create default analysis, so that you have that information at your fingertips right when you need it, when you need to inform decision makers, when you need to do some awareness raising campaigns, that it's easy to use but also customizable, for example, in focusing on a certain time frame or focusing on a certain area, that it's repeatable, so you can save the kind of customized analysis that you did, and that you can use your own data. So if we provide a data set on, like, here's a population living, but actually you have better data, or you have specific data on migratory routes of herders, for example, you can really include that into the existing default analysis as well. And that's where I would like to end. You can yeah, we can have a discussion. I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards, but also afterwards, you're always free to reach out to me. My name is Marie Schellens, so the second email on the list here on the right. Back to you, Annika.
Thanks, Marie, for unpacking your work on Strata. It was really interesting and helpful. I now turn it straight over to Barbora Sedova at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research to talk us through weathering risk, which is their work with Adelphi. Barbora, over to you.
Thanks, Annika. Let me first share my screen. All right. Yeah, so thanks to the organizers, first of all, for giving us the opportunity to have this panel within the practitioners workshop. Yeah, I'm delighted to present you the Weathering Risk Initiative. So let's go straight into the presentation. The three aspects that I want to discuss today is to give you a brief project overview, then the approach that we are taking, and then provide a very brief deep dive on the quantitative parts of the methodology. Weathering risk it's a global climate and security. It's a global climate and security risk and post-site assessment, and it basically addresses the gap that we still are not entirely sure when and how climate change threats aggravate the risks of conflict and threaten security, human security. And Weathering a Risk is a 3-year multilateral interdisciplinary project, and it is led jointly by Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research together with Adelphi, and it is conducted in close collaboration with the German Federal Foreign Office. The initiative has 3 main goals. So first, the Weathering Risk seeks to improve the understanding of when and how climate change impacts threaten peace and security. And in this way, we aim to support risk-informed planning. Secondly, the initiative seeks to strengthen the abilities of governments and international organizations to act on climate and security in affected regions. And third, weathering risk aims to deepen the considerations of climate, sustainable development, security, and peace building as cross-cutting issues in all programs. And in this way, it aims to improve operational responses. So how do we do this? We create a replicable climate security risk and foresight assessment methodology that should be used by a broad range of stakeholders. We look at risks at 3 different timescales, so short, medium, and long term. We have a short, medium, and long term perspective. And one of the most innovative parts of our approach is that we combine state-of-the-art quantitative and qualitative assessments and scenario foresight methods in a completely new way. We will conduct, or we will test our methodology on regional and sectoral analysis. So currently, similarly to the project introduced by Mary, we are also conducting one of the pilot assessments we are working on is in Somalia, in addition to Mali. So how does the overall approach look like? So our assessment is centered around the concept of human security, which basically perceives security in a very comprehensive way. It entails aspects such as economic, food, health, environmental, personal, or political security. And our analytical framework covers all areas that are essential for a thorough climate and security assessment. So basically, we consider climatic pressures, we consider economic, social, and political stability. We look at the interactions between climate change and different drivers of conflict, and we try to improve understanding of contextual factors and the mechanisms behind the complex climate and conflict sort of association. And in order to make our approach usable by a broad range of stakeholders, there will be a different complexities of the approach that we will develop. So of course, the weathering risk assessment that we are conducting is quite complex, but not all of these stakeholders will have the financial or technical capacities to go in so much depth, and therefore we aim to develop or are developing approaches that are also less complex and that can be conducted at different geographies, ranging from local to cross-border levels. And the assessment entails 5 different steps. So in the first step, we will conduct quantitative climate impact analysis. So to do this, we will use data from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, which provides future climate change, or basically within the ISMIP project, it provides data that summarizes climate change impacts across different scenarios, across different climate change scenarios and under different socioeconomic scenarios. Second, we will conduct a contextual analysis. So this will be primarily qualitative, and it will combine sort of literature review and field research, and it will enable us to understand more the context when and how climate change affects conflicts and security. In the third step, we will draw on machine learning, and basically an important point to mention is that we do not aim forecast conflicts, but rather than that, we will use the machine learning exercise to identify different indicators of conflict and to verify the findings from the contextual analysis in the second step. And in the fourth step, as a fourth step, we used elements of foresight and scenario modeling, and lastly, identify responses, policy responses to avoid and minimize risks of conflict in the future. So it's basically a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches combined in quite complex manner. But the overarching aim is to be very comprehensive and to have an ongoing back and forth between all these approaches to simply deepen the understanding on the issue. And the approach will be accessible openly, so everybody will be able to draw on the methodological guide, how to do the assessment. And yeah, as mentioned before, there will be different complexities and different scales at which the assessment will be conducted, and you will be able to find it at our website. So maybe at the end, I would like to give you a brief methodological deep dive on the quanti parts of the assessment. So as for the climate impact analysis, the main goal is to assess climate impacts and related risk in short, medium, and long term, while focusing on countries and regions where the assessment will be piloted. And as mentioned, we will draw on the ISIMIP data from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research that basically provides a comprehensive and consistent picture of the world under different climate change scenarios. So how will, these are the results basically for our test case in Somalia, where you can see the projections of temperature increase for the next until 2080 under RCP 2.6, which is in line with Paris Agreement, and 6.0, which is medium to high emission pathways. And we will have these kind of assessment or climate impact predictions or projections for all sorts of sectors. So here on the right-hand side, you can see projections for a number of very hot days. We have these assessments also geographically differentiated to understand where the risk areas will be in the future. And as I mentioned, we will have it for different sectors. Among other things, we will have it for water availability, crop production, and we will consider different socioeconomic development. So on the left-hand side here, you can see water availability until 2080 without population change. And on the right-hand side, you can see the projection with population change, which provide completely different picture of the impact.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you have about 1 minute left.
All right. Yeah, I have only 2 more slides, so it should be fine. So yeah, and as for the machine learning, maybe just a brief insight how it will feed into the whole analysis. So we will draw on random forests to verify pathways through which and context in which climate change affects risk of conflict, as we learned it in the second step of the assessment, so in the contextual analysis. We will identify a set of indicators that we analyze whether the set of indicators differs for conflict onset or for places that have recent conflict histories. And maybe as a last slide, we are very cautious about not predicting conflict or not forecasting conflict into the future, because currently we see that the models sometimes tend to predict conflicts in places that they do not occur, or vice versa, and we try to avoid this. Yeah, so that's it from my side. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for your presentation on weathering risk. I'm already seeing some questions coming in, so I'm excited to engage. But before we get there, our final presenter is Corey Pattison at the World Bank, who is here to discuss their analysis around climate security in West Africa. Over to you, Corey. I think you're muted. There we go.
I'm unmuted now, I think. Thanks, Annika. Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here virtually, obviously. As part of this panel, I think it's really exciting, the work that's being done with Pattison and Adelphi and with UNEP. So it's really an honor to be a part of this. I think that there's a lot of interesting sort of joint perspectives on this and in ways that it diverges. So look forward to getting into that in the Q&A. Maybe at the outset, I'll mention that, first of all, I sit in the social sustainability and inclusion global practice of the World Bank working in West Africa, which is an operational part of the World Bank. And that is the context in which we're doing this analysis. I think most of the participants here will be familiar with the context of worsening violence in West Africa, as well as worsening climate-related impacts, recognizing that these impacts also stream across national boundaries. We are currently preparing 3 regional projects, one in the Lake Chad region, one in the Sahel region, the 3 border region between Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, as well as the northern part of the Gulf of Guinea, so the sort of immediate south of the Sahel. And so the idea of this analysis is to inform those 3 regional projects and how they address the co-occurrence of these risks and where these risks come together. That is to say, security risks from rising conflict, as well as rising climate-related risks. So, I think the idea, the perspective of this is a very operationally focused one, and internal at the moment, which explains the quality of the PowerPoint. But we are also sort of, I think the idea is to create public goods and platforms for collaboration. A caveat that it's a work in progress. So, the questions that are raised here we may not have the answers to all of them, but they're useful to discuss. Let's see if I can share. Okay. So as I said, the idea is to inform these 3 regional projects by, in the first place, creating joint data sets that sort of aggregate both environmental and conflict-related risks, map the areas where these joint risks are highest, and demonstrate different profiles of vulnerability, rather than just, so we are not taking a sort of composite index approach, but rather, as I'll get into, trying to demonstrate variation of joint risks across this geographic area, and then presenting case studies to demonstrate what these links look like at the local level, as well as what factors of resilience have enabled some of these risks to not become violent. We are also aiming to integrate the diagnostics that we're doing under this analysis under knowledge management platforms, which are included as within each of the regional projects, which are effectively open source platforms for development diplomacy, for knowledge and information sharing across the 15 different national governments which are a part of these projects, as well as facilitating the design of these digital tools. We are experimenting with sort of mobile tools, community level applications that can both sort of, aggregate information up as well as push information down on these issues. And then finally, trying to develop guidance on best practices that could actually inform the project activities under these projects. So the scope you'll see is basically all of West Africa. And here is our dependent variable, which is a merged data set of ACLID and UCDP. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but for the moment, we're looking at a dependent variable of conflict. From an operational perspective, we're also interested in broader social unrest and in institutional fragility. That's a little bit more tricky to model, and that's for the reason we're currently looking at this as a dependent variable. But this sort of shows you the geographic variation of that dependent variable, so you can see where the majority of conflicts are happening during this period, the snapshot. But in the analysis, our scope is from 2000 until 2019. So the 3 parts of the methodology are to create vulnerability clusters, and I'll get into that in a second, through a sort of hierarchical clustering analysis, and that will provide us with a variety of vulnerability profiles at the subnational level, and then to use machine learning techniques based on this vulnerability clustering to measure vulnerability to conflict, to effectively predict where we would see conflict emergence across these profiles. And then we use that to identify locations where the model predicts conflict well through in-sample testing, and where it's less successful. And then we are going to commission case studies in the process of doing that to look at sort of why do we see variation across those three cases of where the model predicts accurately and where it doesn't in both directions. The data sources, we're using publicly available spatial data. We're using a 3-part framework for vulnerability that comes out of effectively the IPCC approach to exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Once we put together that data set, we're using a principal component analysis to assess the variance across the variables, and then effectively sort of reducing the difference through the cluster analysis, sort of combined with dimension reduction statistical analysis to generate groups of settlements that have similar vulnerability profiles to the independent variables. And so this is sort of what it looks like in the Gulf of Guinea. This is our 3-part sort of framework, and I'll get to the variables in a second. But you can see as we sort of move from, you have the sort of night lights, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Here, and we can come back to these. I think that it's useful to talk more about the variable selection across the 3 platforms. But one of the things that I think is one of the biggest question marks for us at the moment is, I think, exposure to conflict. In particular, we're looking at travel time to nearest conflict and the number of conflicts within the region. And I think one of the things that we're interested in bringing in as well is sort of institutional data. So, for example, the geo-ethnic power relations data set to capture, I think, notions of exclusion, perceptions of exclusion as well. But for the moment, these are the data that we're using right now. I'm going quickly because I'm trying to keep to time. This is what happens. So this is the output we get with the sort of merged data. This is, as I said, we're still very early days in this. So I'm bringing in, we've done similar work in Indonesia without the conflict dimension. And effectively, this is the output that we'll get. We'll get a variety of different clusters, which have differential vulnerability to different kind of joint risks. And what we can do then is sort of zoom in on different clusters. So for example, we can zoom in to Sumatra that has about 15 different clusters, which aren't always geographically contingent, and then zoom in even more to then highlight, in this case, a cluster of highland villages that have a particular sort of set of vulnerability to, in this case, just climate-related variables. We then use a set of machine learning techniques with this vulnerability data to assess the vulnerability to conflict in the future, effectively predicting where we think we will see conflict. As I said, then using in-sample prediction, we can see where the model has been accurate and where it's been less accurate, and then overlay these to investigate the relationships between climate and conflict. And we should get... Yep.
1 minute left. Yeah, thanks.
And we should get 3 different cases, right, where the model has done well and less well, and we're commissioning case studies across those 3 areas. As I said, the idea is to link these to the operations. So that's both in the preparation of the projects, that's the sort of targeting of areas that are at the highest level of vulnerability, also monitoring and the design of the activities, also informing the knowledge management platforms through digital vulnerability maps to help policymakers make decisions, not only about these 3 projects, but others, as well as an application that would inform sub-project design and monitoring of the community-led projects that are sub-projects that are as part of these. Without going, I won't go into a lot of detail. I'm happy to answer more in the Q&A since I'm running out of time about the mobile applications. But the idea is to create a sort of 2-way communication between communities and community members on the front lines to aggregate information up, as well as to push information down on the tailored set of risks that different communities face using the vulnerability profiles. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. I'm sorry to rush you through the last part there. And if you all have other questions, kind of building on, especially as I've cut them a couple of our speakers off at the end, please put those questions in. I already see some questions in the chat, which is great. We have about 20 minutes here for a conversation. So please do keep those questions and insights coming along. I'm going to actually start with a question to our panelists to kick things off, and I'd love to hear from all three of you if you have something to add on. So we'll just go in order of speakers. But the first question is really about the choice of variables and indicators to predict conflict. So we'll start with you, Marie. How do you go about choosing your variables and indicators?
Yeah, so we have I mentioned the co-design approach already, but of course we do a deep literature study on what are the scientific, what are the scientific papers saying at the moment that are climate and environmental risks at the moment in Somalia for a pilot, and then we combine those insights also with kind of like surveys, semi-structured interviews, and a workshop with our people on the ground, like what are actually the issues that they want indicators on, that they want data on, and that they want to see monitored. And some of them you won't find in the scientific literature yet, because there hasn't been any historical issues with that. For example, you have like oil exploration you have oil explorations off the coast of Somalia, so there is no problem with oil spills and pollution yet, but that might be a problem in the future, and some of our end users want to be prepared for that. So can we include, for example, an indicator on oil spill monitoring in our platform? So yeah, it's interesting to take this combined approach, which we are.
Yeah, a lot of conversations to be had. Barbara, do you mind answering the same question?
Yeah, thanks. Similarly, as Marie said, we also use a combined approach. So of course, we start with a literature review to understand what our researchers have used as predictors of conflict and indicators of conflict. And then we employ them in our machine learning exercise and see whether they also pop up as being important for conflict, for classification of areas as being in conflict or not. And then we combine these insights from the field, and there is basically an ongoing exchange from what we learn from the literature, what we learn from the quantity analysis, and what the actual practitioners tell us.
And I see a question in the chat about how to navigate quantitative and qualitative analysis. So we'll take that in a minute. I'll come back to that. Corey, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, I mean, not much to add to those two good answers. I think it's basically the same approach to ours. I mean, we're at an earlier stage, so we haven't had the opportunity, I think, to speak as broadly with the number of stakeholders that we would like to, because I think that there are a lot of different perspectives on it. But based, mostly on the literature and in other approaches to similar approaches to date, this is what we've based on. We focused particularly on the sensitivity. On the Palmer Severity Index to water scarcity, because the literature that we were looking at is that agricultural dependence is one of the biggest risk factors, and we feel that drought is, at least now, perhaps the most relevant shock to agriculturally dependent communities. So that's why we're focusing on that. But otherwise, I would just associate myself with the other comments.
Thanks. I want to pick up there and pose one more question to all three of you, and then we'll head over to the chat. And that is around indicators and modeling, especially conflict, but also climate and conflict. There's a question of interdisciplinarity. So the two sort of sets of expertise around conflict sensitivity and early warning, early action around conflict, but then also around the environmental degradation, climate security, and disaster. It's often two different sets of expertise. So how do you navigate sort of multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity in your teams, and sort of almost, as we talk about it at the platform, bridge different languages? So I may take this in reverse order. Corey, can I start with you? It's a tough question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think I agree that I think it is really, it tough thing to navigate. And also I think one of the things that makes this a really interesting field to be working in, because when you put people in a room together that don't normally speak to each other, I think it can be challenging, but you get to, I think, important insights. So for us, for example, and the variable selection that I was talking about earlier, you know, I don't think we've totally solved how this so far. You know, I think, you know, as more of a conflict researcher, the idea that it's sort of geographic, you know, distance isn't totally satisfactory. But you know, what we've tried to do is put together a team working on this that includes political ecologists, that includes political scientists with a background in, you know, political violence, and climate change experts, and then, you know, speak to as many people in institutions doing similar work from as many different perspectives as possible. But I think the interdisciplinary of the team is key. I think if you've only got one side or the other, they're going to just be huge blind spots.
Right, absolutely. There's a necessity to kind of be inclusive on different sides. Barbara, same question.
Yeah, I would just second Corey's point that the interdisciplinarity is basically the key. So for instance, we have teams. So our team for the weathering risk is completely interdisciplinary. We have climate impact modelers, we have economists and social scientists, but also we have practitioners from the field and conflict scientists. And at the same time, yeah, we verify, or we have this ongoing exchange between practitioners and academics, and yeah, so we are trying to not only remain in this theoretical level and always verify everything on the ground.
I also just want to add, if there are other folks who are watching, please add in if you have insights or sort of ideas around how you navigate interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. Please type those into the chat as well. Marie, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Corey and Barbara already said. So we also have an interdisciplinary team, and that means both on the more practitioner side. So we have people that are really working in the peace building field in Somalia, but also we are from UNEP, so we consider ourselves more as environmental experts in this field, but then also on the scientific side, who is developing the scientific methodology. We have researchers from peace and security departments, and we have let's say like researchers from the Geo School who are experts in geospatial monitoring and these things. So the key, I mean, it's difficult. It's definitely difficult. The key is really communication and keep talking and having everybody at the same level and creating the same understanding of certain words. Like if we say hotspot, what do I actually mean with hotspot? Do I mean a conflict hotspot? Is it socioeconomic? Is it somewhere where we should put all the resources of our funding eventually, or is it only a climate hotspot that will only pop up in like 10 years? So it's really about communicating, and it takes a lot of time, but it also makes it interesting and fun to work together with engaged people.
One thing we talk a lot about here in Geneva too is the necessity of unpacking acronyms. We use so many here so quickly. So yes, it's exactly that, about sort of seeking that shared understanding. I'm now going to head over to the chat. We have a few questions. I'm going to start with the more sort of technical questions, as this is a panel about climate security modeling, and then we'll move on. There are a couple of more sort of substantive and thematic questions I hope we get to. Barbara, let me actually start with the question about integrating. How do you methodologically integrate qualitative inputs with quantitative data-driven methods?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question. So basically, in the first step, I think I mentioned this already, we pick a selection of variables that we employ in our machine learning exercise to understand what pops out as an important predictor of conflict. And then we basically build a set of hypotheses to see, okay, our machine learning exercise said these are the important predictors, and we validate this in the semi-structured interviews and interviews with other stakeholders on the ground. So do they also see these variables as being important drivers of conflict, or do they have a different perspective on things? And then we feed this information into our models and have this ongoing exchange to basically improve our understanding on both qualitative and quantitative sides of what is actually happening.
Okay, that's really helpful. Marie, a question for you on Strata. Is the raw data embedded in it available for download? Is it an open science-based platform?
So it will be open science based, although the geospatial platform in itself, that like the kind of source code that makes you play with the data, that is not available openly, but the methodology behind it will be openly published as a open source article, and all the data that we use is also openly available data. So we could forward you to, we could link you to the original source, but you could also directly download it through our platform. That's the intent, yes.
On that note, to my three panelists, if you want to share your emails with our tech moderator, either in the document or in the chat here, she can post that so that in the chat box, so that if people want to follow up, if they have other questions, then they can get in touch with you directly. Just so to note that. I want to move actually to one of the thematic questions that came through, which is more about sort of policy, climate security risk, fragility, et cetera. So I'm just going to read this out a bit. How does the result of the climate security risk analysis, how does it influence the agenda setting of the fragile state? Normally, while environmental factors may amplify the conflict risk, political factors might be the major contributor to conflict outbreak. In this context, it's normal for policymakers to invest more on stabilizing the political situation rather than the conservation. Environmental issues require long-term investment, but might be hard for fragile states to prioritize. How do you think about these questions? This is really sort of the zoom out. This is a bit beyond the sort of climate security modeling, but I'd be curious to hear your responses, and feel free, whichever one of you wants to jump in first.
Yeah, I can answer directly. So in the project that we're currently involved with, it's often a collaboration with these political, more political actors and political NGOs or UN agencies that are working in the field. And so it's true, they have more urgency, like humanitarian aid or IOM working with displaced people. They have more urgency and easier access to the funds. But I think the idea of environmental peace building and environmental security, climate change security, is really, really trickling through, and everybody's understanding that on the long term, we need to ensure that we have a healthy environment that people can actually rebuild their livelihoods on, and that then can lead to more peaceful, more stable society. So at the moment, how I see it is that the environment is often pulled in with it in collaboration with more the political and socioeconomic, like humanitarian aid and diplomacy efforts, for example. So it's yeah, really bringing together the different expertise and the different organizations.
Right, and how can we both be approaching, as most of you talked about today, sort of the human security side with the elements of hard security? And we do have a question in here about military strategic purposes, so hopefully I can get to that. Do either you, Corey or Barbara, want to chime in on that sort of political question?
I mean, just to add, I mean, I think there is, I mean, I totally agree with the framing of the question. I think, you know, where we see the sort of the hot spots, and I agree that that's a phrase that needs to be unpacked, but, you know, where the joint risks are the highest, I mean, these are also the areas that are of political exclusion. These are the areas that already are conflict hotspots, right? In the environmental change and in climate change impacts are making this worse. I mean, I think we need to move beyond the sort of threat multiplier paradigm to see how it's making it worse, but that paradigm is accurate in reflecting the role that I think environmental change plays. And therefore, governance reform, inclusion of those groups economically, socially, and politically has a vital role to play as well. It's not just about sort of climate resilience. I think it's a whole package of reforms. And I think, you know, that is, you know, using this analysis to make that point is the objective.
Barbara?
Yeah, I think I just have to agree with both of them. I have nothing new to add.
Thank you. I think I have time for maybe one more question coming out of the chat before I do have a closing question for everybody here. So it's a question for both Marie and Barbara. To what extent would we be able to use these tools for military strategic purposes at the Ministry of Defense? So that kind of gets into this question of collaboration and utility. I know you're both in the pilot phase, but how would you respond?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the first thing that comes to my mind is that we will make this approach accessible to everyone. It will be open source, available on our website, and basically there are different complexities and different geographies that the end users will be able to pick up depending on their needs. And I think all aspects that are relevant to your research question or to your question, policy question or issue that you aim to address, you can just focus on within your assessment using all the available tools and that we make available on our website.
Marie?
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that. So of course, the answer is yes, we want it to be useful to people who actually work in the peacekeeping and stabilization field. Specifically for our pilot in Somalia, we're working very closely together with colleagues in the UN political mission in Somalia. So many of those are also military personnel that are being deployed to that mission. So yes, definitely we try to make it as relevant as possible. Also, how I understood from our stakeholders is that they need kind of ad hoc, real-time advice to kind of inform daily decisions, also longer-term strategic decisions, but also really on the ground, like, okay, we need to deploy some technical support to kind of a breach somewhere, or there has been flooding somewhere, and we don't want the people, we want to send technical aid to those places, like what is advisable, what is safe, what is and also what is environmentally good to deploy people. So yes, we do hope to be able to inform military strategic purposes as well.
Great. Okay, I know there are now a couple of questions in the chat that I haven't been able to get to, but I want to ask our closing question, as we have been politely invited to end on time. So let's try to do this in the last 4 minutes. To all three of you, and I'll start with you, Marie, again. Do you see a need? So clearly the sort of goal was to talk through sort of best practices, common do's and don'ts, and there's not a clear answer yet. Do you see, this is a leading question, by the way, do you see a need to bring practitioners that model climate security risks together more regularly to continue the discussion? And if so, how do you see that?
I do see that need, because I reach out individually often to similar projects like Barbora's project, like Corey's project, and we try to keep each other up to date. But it might be useful to have a wider community of practice to actually discuss these things. And I don't think we need to start a new platform. I think there's many existing platforms where we could integrate these discussions, but it would be interesting that a bigger group of practitioners in early warning, early action in the climate security field actually joins these discussions, and that we can keep up to date about each other's approaches and new things they learned and innovations and what are the regions they're working in. So I think it's very relevant. And one platform that comes to mind is the Environmental Peace Building Association, that has a specific interest group working on big data. So I think that could be an example of such a platform, but I'm open for any kind of platform that would bring practitioners together and to gather or share knowledge.
And I can already say that if there are folks here who are interested in joining those conversations, you should definitely reach out to any of the panelists, or you can put your email in the chat and we'll make sure that they're following up with you. But Barbara, over to you, same question. How do you see sort of regular continuation of this discussion between practitioners?
Yeah, thanks, Annika. So I think it's really important to sort of share the best practice and maybe also sort of learn from each other and compare what our results are, and whether we, for instance, tend to find similar fragilities, or whether we find contradicting findings, and if so, then why. So I think it would be really interesting, and also to simply share lessons learned, because it's such a complex issue yeah, I mean, and dynamic field that develops very quickly. So it would be really nice to have this kind of ongoing exchange where we could update each other and learn from each other.
Thanks. And Corey, over to you to finish us off. How do you see sort of these common guidelines or conversations moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's two elements. I think the first is effectively what Barbara and Emily have both mentioned. I think, you know, the field's still early enough, although there have been people working in this field for a while, but there is an increasing number of us working on this in its early days, that I think that there's so much to learn on the methodology of this, that having these kind of conversations is tremendously helpful. I think also, as we move from early warning to early action in the theme of this event, I think that, you know, whether those are smaller groups that are self-selected, et cetera, but I think, you know, making sure that we are coordinating as different organizations move to early action is really important, right? And to talk about what do we think should be done in addition to what are the focus areas geographically, because we know that coordination in crisis settings is a perennial challenge. So I'll end there and thank everybody for this really great presentation and panel discussion. And thanks, Annika, for the great moderating.
Thanks to you. Thank you so much to our three panelists, and thank you to all of you for being here. I hope that our panelists' emails have made their way into the chat, and as it is now 15 past the hour, I live in Switzerland and we try to be on time here. So I'll go ahead and say a big thank you and wish you all a great rest of your day.